Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Qatar Urban Forum. My name is Peter Murray. I'm the chairman of New London Architecture, which is London's forum for discussion and debate about issues to do with the built environment. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this very special MIPIM event. And to start off the proceedings, I'm very glad to invite engineer Essa Al-Qadari, the CEO of Lusail Real Estate Development Company, to welcome us to this event. Over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Lord Richard Rogers, distinguished panelists, honored guests. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of Qatar Diyar Real Estate Development Company, Lusail Real Estate Development Company, and Musharraf Properties. We have convened Qatar Urban Forum with the aim of encouraging dialogue among the global real estate community on a progressive, sustainable urban development, a key tenet of Qatar's national development strategy. The state of Qatar is committed to developing innovative, forward-thinking solutions for green, sustainable buildings. We look forward to share knowledge through this forum with other international thought leaders in the field. I encourage you to take a round in Qatar Pavilion before you leave today and learn more about Lusail City and other 48 projects that Qatar Diyar is developing, and Musharraf Property, which is being developed in the state of Qatar. Thank you once again for being here with us in Qatar Forum. I look forward to seeing the result of our discussion here today, as we will strive together toward a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, who better to kick off this event, really, than Lord Rogers himself, with this stellar cast of speakers over the next few days, focusing on the diagnosis about how we deal with sustainable cities in the future. Lord Rogers is probably one of the best placed people to speak to us about that, because not only is he one of the world's most influential designers, with many significant buildings in his portfolio, from the Pompidou Centre in the 1970s through the Lloyd's building, Terminal 5, Madrid Airport, a whole range of radical, innovative and excellent buildings that have created a reputation for delivering architecture of the highest quality. But of course also he's been closely involved in the theory and politics of the city, and particularly in relationship to sustainability, and his highly influential writings on the Compact City, his report for the UK government, the Urban Task Force, has had immense influence not just in Britain but around the world. And also, from a London point of view, his involvement with Mayor Livingston right at the start of the creation of London Mayor ensured that design was high priority in City Hall, both under that administration but also continuing into this one. So it gives me great pleasure to ask Lord Richard Rogers to address us now. Richard.
Good morning. Okay, just finding out where they were. I had a brief time to go around the exhibition downstairs. I was immensely impressed. Qatar is one of the most exciting places in the world in terms of urban regeneration, urban development, and the work that they are doing in sustainability. I'm going to do a brief talk, practically a canter through work that we have done in our office, work over the last 50 years. I've called it From the House to the City because it's a variation of scales. The house is the city is the house. It's a question of understanding that interrelationship. Obviously, I will be talking also about design. We have an office of just under 200 people. The center of it is in London, and we work in a moderately unique way. We haven't got the time to go into any depth, but basically we try not to have other design offices. We have offices for delivering specific projects so that we can use all the thinking power in one single group. I'll walk around so it's easier. Obviously, and I shan't be particularly talking about sustainability. Sustainability is the most critical problem that man faces, and it has every possibility of endangering not only our lives, but certainly our children's lives. It could be, if we don't handle it well, the end of our human culture. I think you know all these things, the idea of using clean energy. Again, I won't use it. Wind power, biofuels, and obviously new technology and new types of fuels. If one thinks the speed of change over just the last 20 or so years, it's breathtaking. So we have the power to make those changes, but we're taking a very long time to create a much cleaner, CO2-free world. I should be talking about the language of architecture, the narrative. I've used this as it's designed for my parents in Wimbledon, just outside the centre of London. And I've put it here because it's sort of, you'll see the bits of it infiltrating in most of the design, in fact, all the design that we have developed. Architects, just like writers or painters, have a certain language. They develop that language. They don't bounce all around the place. And they develop a language which they think can handle, can solve the problems of the built environment. The headings here, and one of the most important is, of course, in red, environmental sustainability. That has changed. People ask me, what has changed most during my long life? It has to be the recognition of the importance of the environment. Yes, we did know. In fact, this house was a sort of offspring from a house we designed for a competition in London in 1966, which was made out of refrigerator parts, so as to keep the energy in. Actually, truck refrigerator parts. The walls of this house still have it. There holds lots of elements within the house, which aims at keeping a balance with the energy. Then the more subjective elements like light and transparency. For me, light and transparency is critical. Both views out and light in. Legibility, to understand how a building is put together. It's very difficult today to say what is a house, what is a warehouse, even what is a church, because all these things change. I often say the best nightclub in Rome is in a church, which brings up a question of what is a church and what's a nightclub. The image is no longer directly related to the object that you design because change is so fast, because we have to adapt all the way around us. Cities are changing, and if cities have thousands of 6,000 years of life, they have changed during that time. Process of scale, grain, and rhythm, that's the poetry of architecture. The scale, the grain, the rhythm. Flexibility and adaptability, because again, it's all about change. This house, which everything can move inside, is now occupied by one of my sons and his family. He's a designer, and he's a much messier person than my parents, but he has managed to adapt to it very easily. A sense of place. Buildings have to have a sense of place. We're discussing this question of, you can't make a building in abstract. I do not believe that we're not sending spaceships around. We're rooting buildings into the society which has a certain speed of movement, has a certain speed of looking, feeling, and so on. So a sense of place which many buildings do not have. And I was excited by the models which I saw downstairs. They had a much greater sense of place than most of what things I see. And of course, the private and public, and the erosion of public space, a critical problem. This is an oldie. Peter Murray mentioned it. with Renzo piano, Peter writes from over Arabs, competition we won when we were in our early 30s. Had we known how complicated, we probably wouldn't have built it. But having said it, we were fortunately sufficiently naive to think we could do anything. And somehow we got there. But the critical thing here is it's the first few lines of the competition. And we wrote down, and there was a competition which we had, it was the first major competition in Europe. And there were 700 entries. Again, if I'd known there were 700 entries, I certainly wouldn't have done the competition. Luckily, I didn't know. But we wrote down a place for all people, all creeds, all ages, for the poor and the rich, a place for the meeting. And that's what cities are about, meeting of people. I mean, that's the one thing which is unique to cities. You can meet, like here. It's very difficult to meet in the suburban sprawl. And so that's intensification of the meeting, and cities are for the exchange of ideas, for meeting of people to exchange ideas. And of course to manufacture and so on. And that hasn't changed again for 6,000 years since those first cities in the east. The horizontal piazza, obvious space, and then the facade is also a public space. So all this facade is live with people. You'll see it in a moment. And the whole building is really a framework. Yes, it mainly has a very big library, which when we built it was for books. But of course, books are practically non-existent when you go into the library because it's all IT, talking about speed of change. For music, for design, restaurants, cinemas, and so on. So it's a big framework which can change and adapt to the changing needs and then to the changing political situations. It's probably the most successful, in terms of people, 7 million people a year, successful public building in terms of numbers of people. Where it was built, where the competition was held, was right in the center of Paris, but also the poorest part of Paris, as you can see in this image over here. It was pretty derelict. Now, that's the Seine. So this is the center of Paris. But this area, which used to be the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto at one point, had been left behind. And this was the site, which was a car park. And the point I make here with this building is that this area has been totally regenerated. It's now one of the most beautiful, most used areas, and has linked up with the rest of Paris rather than being a barrier. People watch people, people meet people. There's tremendous beauty about the poetry of these are here, I think, it's whether fighters or acrobats or musicians. So the form as people come to watch people. And the view across Paris. And we celebrate movement. We think movement is one of the things which all buildings have. And we don't see why you should go down back stairs or be pushed into a little elevator and not have any advantages. Whereas here you look out, you're looking out and you celebrate. It gives you scale and it gives you form and it breaks down the whole question of the box. It's the scale of the hand. And this is very much the process of construction, but it's also the scale of the hand. Here's the scale of the leaves, if you like. That it's the small scale that makes the building human. It's not the size. Height and width is a very secondary way of measuring the impact. Lloyd's, the next major building which we were lucky to win. Lloyd's of London, insurance, the biggest insurance firm in the world. This is 1979, just as a couple of years after finishing Pompidou Center, Beaubourg, as it was then called. We were very fortunate to win this competition as we hadn't, again, built anything like it. People often say to me, well, have you built one before? And I keep on saying, well, actually, we've done rather better with things we haven't built before. Because maybe you can be more imaginative. And it's a form of office building, but actually it's a market. It's just like any market. It can be a fish market where it's got people selling things. It needs a big atrium. I remember very well the chairman of Lloyd's saying it has to have two things. It has to have an atrium so we can see people, and it has to have the possibility of meeting the needs into the next century. That's this century. We've made that part. And so growth and change. Now we what we did with the building is to say, well, if this is a normal plan of a Lloyd's with an atrium, And then you have to have, because of distances of fire escapes, these are your lifts, these are your toilets, these are all your services. If you do that, then this interferes in the space. If you reverse it and you say, okay, you can have a big yellow space, which is where the trading floors are, that's over here, and then you put the cores, you do two things. These are short life, because they've got all the technology in it, and the technology will change. You know, the simple things like all the electronics of 1980 is totally different to the electronics of today. Everything has been ripped out. Air conditioning is changing. Now, this building has air conditioning, though it's quite advanced air conditioning. I'll talk about it. But we don't usually, in the British climate, we don't use air conditioning any longer. Practically don't use air conditioning. So all this is changing. You should be able to get to it. So the point being made that you can get to these cores without disturbing the work going on inside, so things can be adapted. Of course, that's the functional. The aesthetic is that there is a dialogue created between the vertical towers and the sort of the warehouse where the people actually work in. And that dialogue, which is the play of light and shadow, which is what architecture is about, is very much again about the poetry of the building. It reaches up for the sky, and it also gives us a rich articulated skyline. And we used to have that, of course. Wonderful churches we have in London, the wonderful spires, domes, towers, have sort of been lost during the modern movement. Here you have a functional element, which of course is expressed partly in a poetic way, and breaks down the scale and breaks down and adds to the skyline. The spirit of the interior, the big interior space, these are the floors around the building. When we built Lloyd's was a very big building. Now it's probably the smallest building in the center of the city. It's interesting again. In 20 years, 30 years, the building again has changed in its relationship to the site fantastically. There are some other interesting questions about the form of the city in terms of scale. Again, the play of light and shadow. This is one of the trading floors, the market, if you like. You can see it here. The celebration of how you put a building together. One of the dangers is that, and often people asking architects, they say, I want a sketch. And actually, when we finished the Lloyd's building, we had a wonderful board and a great chairman. And I remember well the chairman saying to me, why didn't you tell me what it looked like? And I think I answered this because I don't really know. I didn't know. Because, of course, as it grows, you grow with it. You adapt it. You don't remember you do. But if you think back, it's actually the building that is informing you as much as you're informing your building. There's a dialogue between the two. And here we express, these are all the bits of technology that makes a building. We have triple glass here, and the air conditioning goes through the glass. This is a living wall. It means that you go right close to the glass, whether it's hot or cold, which is very efficient in terms of energy use, but it's also comfortable. But it also allows you to celebrate the fact of a bit of air conditioning which is going through the glass. And this, again, I won't study this, but basically the sort of studies we made, or actually let's say a study that Arabs made, of energy use within Lloyd's, which was probably the first efficient building. Pompidou, we were less conscious of it, of energy, though we had done some work on it. It is very deep planned, so it's not so inefficient, but this is much more efficient and moves now towards understanding the sort of problems that we're facing. This is the Welsh Parliament, the Welsh Assembly in Cardiff. And it's really, again, a discussion more about the public domain. I keep on coming back to the defense of the public domain. One of the dangers is we continuously privatize our public domain. Welsh Assembly, the bay, you can see over there. And the idea has been that the people can come into the building with prams, sit on the steps and so on, and that all this part here is public. That whole thing is public space. When it's open, which is open for about 10 hours of the day, anybody can use it, just as they can use the steps which go down into the water. Then when you come into the space, you can look down on the Parliament, that's the Assembly, down there, and again there's a relationship. The Assembly has to be secure, so it's a moderately good place to put it in slightly below ground, shall we say. But it's also in a good relationship between the people and the servants of the people, the servants being below the people. Moving forward, the workplace, again we're changing. I mean, we were, when I started, and we still do, we were brought up with the idea that offices, and this is offices, had a sort of, I see developers sometimes, they say, look, this is our core, and the core, this is the site, this is the core, and the distance between the core and the wall is X meters. And then I say, what do we do? I mean, as architects, once you've set all those elements out, what is the game? And of course, if you do it with a central core, which is what you usually do, this one here, let us say, that's a central core standard building. That's actually the Ground Zero plan, the New York World Center plan. There's very little flexibility for anything but lines of death, because there's not enough movement spaces. There's not enough places where you can cluster together. There's not enough places where you can have a canteen, or whether you can have. So whether it's open plan or closed, which is a minor part of the discussion, these are very, very prescriptive plans. So we've been looking at different ways of doing plans. That's Lloyd's, for instance, so that you can have much more flexibility, much more movement within it. As I've said, that gives you the possibility of articulation of the building as well, which is an aesthetic benefit. And these are some variations. It's a developer built building, 8 Wood Street. These are the cores. Actually, it's that plan over there. And they're very transparent, and they're very light, remembering that English climate is not the same as Qatari climate. In other words, we don't have a serious climate change, a climate variation problem. Moving on to what I call vertical villages. Neither of them have been built so far. This is in San Francisco, a tower which was going to be the tallest tower, maybe the tallest tower, on the west coast of the States, which is built where it should be built, but as it's tall tower, right on the transportation interchange, and there's a market underneath the transportation. So this is retail and shopping down here. And this is a tower which is made up of retail at the bottom, piece of university, a hotel, housing, residential, offices, all the way up. So and what you've got here is a series of movement structures, which are the structures, the red pieces, which hold this village together. And I think we're moving towards this. I'm interested to see that there is probably less in the States, but certainly in Europe, there is now beginning to be an acceptance that there's no reason why we should divide things up: work, live, leisure. And by the way, it's very much more energy efficient, because obviously if you have a hotel which is used at night and you have an office which is used at day, you can even out the energy intake. So there's a lot to be said for that. This is on Central Park, more or less does the same thing, went a bit further than this. And again, the idea of different floors, different floor plans, which swing around the core. In this situation, the core is actually in the center. In this situation, the cores are on the outside. A building which didn't get built, Saudi Stock Exchange. And here, because of tremendous temperatures, we made an inside-outside building, inside out. We put the greenery down the center of the building. So there was a great vertical space. So people could go out from their floors and enjoy, not only look up and down, but be in a green area. And on the outside, of course, tremendously carefully worked out grillage systems to avoid the sun, to avoid heat gain. These are just studies of landscape and so on. But again, what I'm saying is the basic concept of a building with a core and then glass or other material around the outside needs to be questioned. It may work in some places. I'm not saying it doesn't work in some places. But overall, it talks about a past era, an era where there was no problems with energy, a time when people didn't meet as they do here, sometimes very informally, where people don't collect in corners and so on. It dictates a way of life which I think is past. But the critical thing is, whatever the way of life is today, it will change too. So you have to, flexibility has to be a key part of this. This is the World Trade Center. We're doing that tower here, which tries to express the idea that about height and about reaching up, as those wonderful cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals which reached up to the sky, and it has some of that element. There are actually three. There's a Norman Foster one over here, and a Mackey building over here, and an SOM building over there. SOM is sort of done for a different user. Mexico City. I just put this up here because it, again, tries to break down, saying there are gardens in the sky. We're doing this with Legarreta. Ricardo Legarreta just died, in fact, but his son continues his practice. We always work with a local architect. Difficult to talk about Legarreta as being local. He's not as international as we are. But if we do work with an architect. And this shows, again, the breakdown in scale of the components, gardens, and so on. And it has a very interesting plan. It's a diagonal plan through the center of the building. And then from here, Leadenhall building, back to London. That's Lloyd's. I don't know if you can see it. You probably can't see it, but that is that little building there, which was the tall building in London, is now invisible, which tells you something about what happens in 30 years, sort of thing. And we shaped Lloyd's quite carefully, so we went down to meet the lower scale down this side, up here, forget it. Tremendously lengthy discussions with Heritage about how it had to fit in the environment. Anything we didn't allow for was that the environment was going to change. So it sort of, again, tells you it's fascinating. Now this is the cluster. This is now the city cluster. My own feeling is if there is, I'm pro, obviously, conservation. But it ends, A, what conservation, and B, recognition that if you have high buildings, then it might as well be as high as possible, because once you're above, let's say, 10 stories, you've lost contact with the ground. So at that point, depends obviously where you are, and I'm not suggesting that will work everywhere, but it certainly doesn't. People say, well, 40 stories are all right, and 60 stories is too much. And I say, well, has anyone noticed what a 40 or a 60-story building means? They're more or less the same. At that scale, they are the same. So that's the building which we're talking about in a moment here. I often say constraints are really what makes architecture. It's how you deal with constraints. It's, what you need to do is to turn those constraints upside down and see whether you can find a way of making some poetry out of it. This constraint here is the view of St. Paul's. This is the way down, view to St. Paul's. And you can see that corner possibly, a little piece of Leadenhall Street down there. It has to have a clear air space. Therefore, it can't go straight up, otherwise it will impinge on St. Paul's. And St. Paul's is probably the most important single building, well, it is in London. So it leans back out of the way. Like we had a very good, British Land, a very good developer. And we had a city who was willing to help and work with us. So government was very interested. And we created a 7-story massive public space at the ground floor. The glass doesn't go all the way down, so it's open to the public use. There are cafes, shops, and so on within this space. So you've got both public domain and the building stepping out of the way, and again trying to create a rhythm of poetry and an easy legibility of the building, how it's put together. Airports have become the gateways of our cities. This is Madrid, Terminal 4. There's something wonderful. There was something wonderful about traveling. I have great memories of standing just after the war in Paris station and watching trains going off to the most amazingly magical names. And in those days, travel of distances was difficult. But it was very mysterious, and it was dynamic. And those great Victorian 19th century stations are still symbols in our cities. Somehow we lost that as we became more, inverted commas, functional, which is not a good excuse for having a bad building. But as we became more functional, so the spaces became meaner. They became more like machines without spirit. And so we say, well, how do you do this? And this is New York Central Station. And it's a wonderful photograph, obviously taken in the 1930s, with the light streaming in. But it is mysterious, beautiful, and functional. And that's what we tried to catch in our own way 10 years ago with this airport. It's immensely long. It's twice the size of Terminal 5, which we completed in London. And we wanted to humanize, so you have wood roofs, and we've used color. Now, you know, color is always a wonderful area in which you can argue forever, and nobody's ever quite right. So we decided to use the palette of the rainbow. Basically, it's all the colors. And then in a romantic way, I often say, well, rather than saying we'll meet at gate 60, you can say we'll meet under the pink column. So that it gives us sort of individual contact with the person. Some apartments and flats. Number 1 Hyde Park. This was done with Qatari and Candy Brothers. I gather, I hate making these things, but I gather it is one of the most expensive blocks of apartments. It wasn't specifically designed, but it is a fantastic site, because the site has one of the great parks of the world, Hyde Park on one side, and one of the great shopping areas, Knightsbridge, on the other side. So you're looking at it. You're right, there isn't probably a better site than this site. And what we did, it has a strange width. We couldn't put a single building across this because we couldn't get the number of dwellings in it. We wanted to stay the same height, more or less, as the buildings. So we ended up by having a series of pavilions. And of course, the problem with pavilions is you have to find ways in which they stop looking at each other, and they have these blinkers on, which I'll speak in a moment. And so there basically are 4 pavilions with service corps in between. Those are the so-called blinkers. And when you're in the rooms, you don't actually notice. You're looking out sideways. And this gives you the concept of scale and grain. We try to find a rhythm, a color, and so on, which reflects a certain amount the red brick area in which these buildings are built in. Not quite so luxurious, but also extremely, I think, successful. Native land next to the Tate Modern, Tate Bankside, is a series of towers. Now this is very much also about the fact that London has changed. This area all here was no man's land. This is the south side of the river, and there was nothing there. Now the south side of the river is probably the most exciting part of London. And with all this urban regeneration, with culture, with lots of buildings and so. And again it talks about how does a building go together, where does the scale come from? Sporting d'Hiver, Monte Carlo, just down the road from you. The removal of the old building here, and the development of a series, again, of pavilions, six pavilions, residential with 1 office area, but also a street which has retail at its base, and this is a new small street which we've created within that, and then residential above, and also paying some notice to the scale of the buildings around, which of course are Belle Epoque. And this is not attempting to imitate the Belle Epoque, but it's recognizing that we can use that scale, that it's an interesting scale, and using these big terraces, which begins to talk about a link with the neighboring buildings. This gives you a pretty good idea what it's like. And the living rooms have these big fold-back glass walls, which are these great views towards here. And moving a little bit from buildings to the compact city. I talk a lot about the compact city. I've been talking about the compact city. And the idea that the city is, the meeting place and it's the powerhouse, and more we're seeing cities becoming the dominant part of nations. London is so much more alive, than 20 years ago. It has changed radically over the last 20 years. I often point out that in London, when we built Lloyd's, there were discussions whether Lloyd's should move to Frankfurt, because Frankfurt was going to be the next capital of Europe, in business terms. Now, nobody talks about it. Basically, London is it. How long for? We will see. So there is a continuous change, and how you get the vitality and liveliness out of cities is the critical part. How do you develop? How do you regenerate? And I believe very strongly, and it's a word I like very much, which is retrofit, both in terms of brownfield land, derelict land, and existing buildings, that you should stitch together the existing environment, if you have one, and London has plenty of it, before you start to spread out. So Pienza, which is the first model Renaissance city, Pope Pius II came from this little village in Tuscany with this beautiful valley in front. And here you have a very clear view of what a compact city is. The city is the city, the country is the country. The two are two parts of the same coin. They both need protection. If you sprawl out, this happens to be Nice, but it didn't have to be. You get every country, every city has it. And if you start sprawling out, you not only destroy the countryside, but you destroy the city, because that means you've got to have cars. Now, again, back to the sustainability and energy. It has been calculated that the sprawling city uses about 5 times as much energy as the compact. The car is a minor part of this. It's the fact that the minute you sprawl out, you have to have new schools, new hospitals, new town halls. Everything else has to go with it. And of course, even as bad as having to build new is you're emptying out, especially in most Western cities which are not specifically growing, like it's not China. So it empties out the city, you get sprawl within the city. That's fear. Empty spaces in cities are frightening, don't work well. That's where we should be working. So very quickly, perhaps the best bit of urban regeneration is probably Barcelona, which used to be along the sea all derelict because there was a great port here, then it became derelict, and Barcelona was cut off from the sea. Now there's amazing beaches, and Barcelona is one of the best, the most urban regeneration cities, which shows urban regeneration. The London plan was designed, we put it together, Ken Livingstone and my team, at the GLA, and it has certain principles which are being held by the present mayor as well, who I worked for a while, and which is basically maintain the green belt. We're very fortunate, after the war, we began to realize that green belts protected cities. Any belt doesn't have to be green. And the idea that the edge of the city should be practically a wall as much as possible, bounce back the economy, bounce people back into the city. So all future construction should be on derelict land. England has more derelict land probably than any Western city because, of course, it used to be a great industrial city, manufacturing. It has very little manufacturing. We are full of brownfield. Increased density around public transport. 50% of all residential housing should be social housing, affordable housing. We never got to 50%, we got to about 37%, and that's the one part that has been changed by the new mayor, Boris. Maybe major public transport investment, including bike hire, buses, congestion tax, very successful, reduction of CO2. Now, we're doing the same stuff. We're doing Sarkozy has asked us to look at Paris. We're doing more of the same thing, looking at Paris, with more or less, we've got 10 principles rather than 6 principles, but with the same view of what one could do with Paris. Moving on down the urban regeneration, down the Thames. This is typical Thames. It's all derelict because it used to be a great port, but no big ship needs to come into the inland so far. So we have acres. This is probably the biggest piece of derelict land in Europe. Now, we're now rebuilding. We're building on it. Of course, the Olympics, which are the, and not only the Olympics, which is the sort of, you could arguably is the minor part, but what is fantastic is there's the legacy here, and there are parks and housing and a whole new quarter. That's in this area here. So this is all a new green park. Canary Wharf is expanding. There used to be nothing here in 2006, practically, a tiny bit. Actually, by 1990, there would have been nothing there. 2006, we begin to get a few towers. Then you have Woolwich, the Dome, and so on. So you're beginning to get a city for 500,000 people over there. I expect, and I would not be surprised to see West and East London practically switching sides, because it's much better planned than West London, because it's been planned now. Money is being pushed into it, and so I'm very optimistic of what's going to happen here between the Olympic legacy and the transportation, 2 new lines of transport. I believe East London, just like East Berlin is the place you want to live now. East Berlin, when we used to live there in just before the wall went down, nobody wanted to be in East Berlin. Now everybody wants to be in East Berlin. I think it may well happen to London. And finally, Sydney. I said we do a lot of urban planning. Beautiful, beautiful city. That's the aerial view. That's the city, the business center of Sydney. A vast area which was part of the port, the container port, big concrete platform, completely losing the line of all these beautiful crags, just slammed into there. Now the container port has been moved, and after many years, we are now developing this piece. Half of that piece is going to be greenfield. In other words, so we've brought back the original, or more or less the original line. This will be all park over here, and then here you have a complete quarter of offices, retail, residential. It's a district development. And part of the Clinton Green study, and this is going to be of immense importance in terms of adding to Sydney, which is in itself a beautiful city. And very briefly, coming towards the end, basically what we've done is to create a podium of about 6 stories, 4 to 6 stories, over the site, cutting streets into it, streets that lead to the transportation hub over here. There's a hotel in this area here, and then put the taller building on top of this podium to try and give play 2 scales, the scale of the city at human scale and the scale of the towers. Here you can see that's the hotel, the development is along here, the park on the edge here. Coming to the end, I will say only 2 things. One, this isn't Pompidou. We've had an exhibition traveling around the world. It's just about to open in Hong Kong, going to Beijing, which is, again, about from the house to the city, of the work we've done over the last nearly 50 years. I started with Norman Foster after Yale, 1962, so it starts somewhere around there, with our wives. And that's to say, architecture is really very much about the relationship between the physical built environment and people. It's the enjoyment. And that's, thank you very much.
Now we've got just 10 minutes for questions. If people have got something they'd like to ask Lord Rogers, please put up your hand. But perhaps I could just start by saying, did I understand you right? You said the era of glass buildings is over.
Yeah.
You didn't say that.
No, I didn't say it.
So there are people in the audience who might think that that is the case. And how would you defend glass as a part of the sustainable city going into the future?
Well, I mean, you can treat glass with so many, and by the way, you treat it every decade. We treat it in a bit different ways. I showed it on Lloyd, where we use triple glass or double glass. You can have reflective glass. It'd be pretty awful not to have any view out from here, can I say? I think it's a sort of, I mean, if you do it without thinking, you've got a problem, but then you've got a problem without whatever material you use. But glass is likely for the next period that I would have thought to be a major part of whatever building you like. After all, it's how you handle materials.
Who would like to ask a question? Well, while people think, I'll ask another one. I think that you say tall buildings might as well be as tall as you like once you get into them. To a certain extent, in London, most tall buildings are a matter of discussion rather than finite decision by planners. But clearly there are issues to do with neighbours and so on, which are a problem. What do you think is the ideal sort of height and density for cities then, in terms of...
I don't believe in static ideals, depending on the area. I remember Le Corbusier, when he first visited New York and asked, what do you think of this, this is 1930 something, what do you think of this magnificent city? He said, the towers are not tall enough. I've always remembered that remark. In a sense, would it be any difference if the towers were 10 stories more in New York? I mean, 20 stories more? What point do you say? Depends where, of course, depends on neighbors. But, there's a wonderful letter about the Strozzi Palace when it was being built, from the neighbours saying, I mean, this ghastly skyscraper, didn't use that word. Of course, it's all about scale. I mean, the Strozzi was basically, I suppose, equivalent to, it's a 4-story, 5-story, but actually equivalent to 8-story. Everything was 1 story. It's relative, which doesn't mean you can put tall buildings anywhere you like.
Yes, lady just here. There's a microphone just coming so everyone can hear you. Just coming towards you. The lady in the blue here. Yes, thank you.
I'm interested.
I can hear. Yeah.
You're speaking to so people at the back can hear you too, yes.
I'm interested with the Pompidou Centre that we saw in Lloyd's. There was a big kerfuffle at the time about the design and people were very interested in it. With places like Doha, you almost have a blank canvas and there are buildings growing up that are exciting and innovative, but does that bring with it an additional responsibility?
I think it brings a new responsibility rather than additional. In other words, clearly, if you're working in Venice, which is just to take a, there is such a fabric that nearly anything you do is in danger of upsetting that fabric. Which, and it's also related to all the buildings, the canals, and views from, over the last 1,000 years. If you're working on a, shall we say, more blank piece of ground, then you have other constraints. Environment sustainability being a critical. Scale of man is also scale of man. So there's probably little reason to build in some of these areas very tall because you've got lots of land. Now, I'm not discussing Qatar and Doha, but in many places there's not a lot to be said for having tall buildings, probably in some of the new towns that we have built in England. Because now, there is an argument, which I quite like, which is that lifts or elevators are much more sustainable than streets. In other words, height is much more sustainable than streets because you don't need a car. Because you've got a sort of vertical tram system very built in. I haven't taken this very far, but it's sort of interesting.
Anybody else have a question, Lord Rons? Yes, gentleman there.
Hello. I have a question. Do you have the same feeling of losing identity of architecture? That if you see the buildings here at the MIPIM, a lot of them are like replaceable. So is there like a development where architecture is more and more replaceable in the whole world? Do you have the same feeling? Or do you have any advice on how to build more with the site again? Or if architects have the possibility, or if they don't have the tools? I mean, like, you know what I mean?
Sort of. I'll try.
It's just about the replaceability of
yes.
architecture in the last 10, 15
yes.
years.
The speed of change is increasing. I mean, I think that's nature. It's very difficult to sort of say, except if you are working, as I was saying, back to the Venice situation, if you like, where it's more complicated. It's very difficult. You can't hold back change. So, in most places, most of the cities we live in, and I'm not talking about the Middle East, which is a different problem, but in most of them, they have their own fabric, they have their own scale, and you can certainly change that, because in some areas, so what does it matter if you do change the scale? My point with that second to last image, with the City of London, which was so careful not to break the 6th story, where Lloyd's was the tallest building, 30 years ago. Now we have these towers. I would find it very difficult to say they haven't added to the city. I think they have added to the city. On the whole, I think the towers are better than the low buildings, interestingly enough, probably because they've been scrutinized more, or maybe because they've gone to offices which have a better understanding of what buildings are. I don't know really. It depends. I'm not against quick change. It depends how it's done. If a building I'm very much pro, again, using the word which sort of fits into yours, which is retrofitting. I'm very much pro that, replacing things which are already there when they've come to the end of their life, and when you can make more with it. For instance, introducing housing, often residential in areas where there's no residential, brings security, it brings eyes on the street, it brings warmth, it brings immediate appeal. So you might argue that empty city areas are a problem. I think they are a problem. I have memories of being in cities in the States where you had to travel 10 miles to go and get a coffee, you know, because it was just offices.
There's a gentleman at the back there.
In the city I live in, it's just very interesting to hear your comments, Lord Rogers, about the One Hyde Park and tall buildings being a refuge in a way, and a haven. But where I live, we've knocked down a lot of tower blocks because they've become ghettos for the poor. How do you avoid that? How do you turn the large building into more of a haven for people who don't have a lot of money?
Just first of all, I'm not promoting tall buildings. And by the way, number 1 Hyde Park is within the scale of it's at the top end of the scale, but we worked very hard to keep it within the sort of scale of that area, because it is, we felt, worth preserving that scale. Actually, I'm not sure we did, or whether the councillors and the locals, who are pretty powerful, also did. In terms of, and I do quite a lot of work on this question, because I chair something which is called the National, where all the national tenants, who often live in tall, that's the social housing, in tall buildings. The main problem about tall buildings is maintenance and organisation. You know, if you go on the continent, tall buildings are natural, partly because they have a family sitting at the door, checking who's on the 35th floor and whether they need some bread or... And so you have the concierge. Concierge is not an English... Well, in fact, the word says it itself. It's not an English concept. Tall buildings need someone to look after them. They can't be the cheapest buildings. It's not an excuse for cheap buildings. I think England has suffered a lot because it's only lately begun to understand what tall buildings are, and the ones that work tend to be the more expensive ones. Whereas, I'm going to say, let's say, in many other countries, starting with Italy, you have tall buildings which work perfectly well.
Thank you very much. Well, we are getting to our time. There's just one more question. Just.
My question is, you've worked with London and with Paris. You're now in with Barcelona. You're now working with Paris. As in Qatar, you know, we're looking at ways to stitching together a good city, a thoughtful city. And I wondered if you thought it worked well, an architect working with the city leaders creating a plan, and what were the lessons learned, or any advice you have on that subject after having done now almost 3.
Done a few more which didn't get built, but or some did. I mean, I think obviously architects, because they deal with 3-dimensional space, which is the way you solve people's needs in physical space, you need to choose the right ones, and you work with them. Now, I don't think it's only the leaders; it's also the public, and those who followed the latest debates in England, where we're going towards localism, and where we're looking at processes in which the local people can have a bigger say. So the local people can say. I mean, in the end, I'm very against the concept that architecture is an abstract. It's not the same as writing a book. You can do it. You can do that in your study or on your computer, and you can do it in any way. Architecture is about place, and place is very, very important. Now, place doesn't mean you can't have new ideas, but the constraint of place is what gives you those ideas.
Thank you very much. Well, we are up to schedule now, and I'm sorry, those people who did want to ask a question, I'm sure Lord Rogers is happy to answer it afterwards, but there's a busy schedule today, so we better stick to it. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to this first session, and thank Lord Rogers for addressing us.
Thank you.